Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tony Cully-Foster. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Nigeria last year became the economic leader of the continent of Africa. Out of 54 nations, they were regarded as having the strongest economy and the prospects for very sustained major growth. I had the opportunity to meet Nigeria's president, President Jonathan Goodluck, when he was here for the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. And I was impressed by him because he appeared to be a reasonable man. He has proved that he is a reasonable man by the manner in which he has accepted the vote of his electorate in Nigeria on this recent election. The fact that he called the man who was the victor by the popular vote made a very big impact on me, and I think for the rest of the people in the United States who care about our relationship with Africa. It was a breath of fresh air to see an African leader amicably, diplomatically step down, park his personal feelings on the side, and do what was best for his country. So kudos to President Jonathan Goodluck. We wish him well, I am sure, all who care about democracy, all who care about freedom, all who care about a closer relationship between the United States and Nigeria and the continent of Africa. I've had the pleasure of knowing lots of Nigerians in my travels throughout the world. I first met a Nigerian community when I came as an Irishman to go to university in England. And I know that among the 4 tribes in Nigeria, that I've worked my way up to the top. We have some people here who are Yoruba in our audience. And I feel very strongly that despite the violence in the north, despite the help that the nation of Nigeria got from some of its neighbors in Africa, that the first prerequisite for the new president of South Africa is to make sure that his country is secure, which leads us to tonight's program. We're very fortunate to have 2 people who care deeply, not only about Nigeria, but about Africa. Hilary Matfess, who is our discussant tonight, is doing her graduate work at Johns Hopkins University. She studied Boko Haram. She studied violence and counterterrorism, and she's a friend of our speaker tonight, Ambassador Renee Sanders. Ambassador Sanders has had a distinguished career in the diplomatic corps. She's an academician, as well as a respected voice on multiple geopolitical aspects of the relationship between Nigeria, other African nations, and the United States. It's my honor to introduce both of these distinguished speakers to our forum tonight, and I hope that you as an audience will better understand the ethos of the World Affairs Council after tonight's program. We are an institution that's dedicated to being a place where learning happens. You've got 2 capable teachers here tonight who are going to share with you their knowledge on an issue that I think is important to our country as well as to the people of Nigeria. So join me in welcoming, please, our 2 guests tonight.
Good evening.
Good evening, Hilary. How are you?
Doing well. How are you?
Good, thank you.
So you recently returned from observing the presidential and senatorial elections in Nigeria. Which state were you an observer in, and can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
The part of the mission that I participated in, we were in the north central region of Nigeria. And if you don't know Nigeria, the north central is kind of a bridge between the north and the south, and it really is a mixture of Nigeria in so many ways. It has a variety of ethnic groups. It has pretty much a balance between the population of Muslims and Christians, and so it really is a way to get a pulse of the nation. I really wanted to be either in the north or in the north central, and so I was in the north central region.
Great. And while you were there, how did the elections seem to you? Did you witness any irregularities? And what was sort of the sense in north central, which, if I recall correctly, went fairly heavily for the opposition party, the APC?
Right. I think that the sense that the team that I was with had was that you really could feel that there was a desire for change as you engage with the voters, in a non-influential way, but just to kind of hear what they were thinking in terms of, why were they standing in line for 12 hours in the hot sun with no food and water. The key thing that I heard the most was that I want change, and I want a better and a different future for Nigeria. Never asked anybody, of course, who they were voting for, but you had this sense, particularly as you listened to people in line, and as you were there at the close of the voting process, and you heard the vote count, and you could see where things were headed, at least in that region.
That's exciting. I recently, I believe 2 weeks ago, was in Nigeria just before the elections. Unfortunately, I couldn't go over as an observer, but I had the opportunity to travel to Kano and Jigawa states, and I was speaking with farmers and traders there, and I absolutely agree. There's a real commitment to the democratic process, and I met with a lot of people who expressed a strong desire for change.
Exactly.
So what should we expect under President-elect General Muhammadu Buhari? What sorts of change do you think his administration will prioritize as they move into the office?
Well, I'm underscoring what he has actually said his stated mission and goals are. That really is to move Nigeria forward. It's to primarily deal with the insecurity in the Northeast, to combat corruption, and he's always been known as a strong advocate for anti-corruption efforts, so that's not new for him. To address economic issues and fundamental human indicator issues, and that means poverty, food security, job creation, whether it's formal or entrepreneurial. So he's got a huge mandate. He's talked about a huge mandate, and the key now will be to see how he moves all of that forward.
As you sort of alluded to, President Muhammadu Buhari has quite the reputation for being a staunch bulwark against corruption, particularly during his time in office in the 1980s. Should we expect his second term in the office of the executive in Nigeria to be similar or dissimilar to how he exercised authority in the 1980s?
I would expect it to have some of the same pillars in it, but I would think that his style would be quite different. He's refashioned himself, in his own words, into a new Democrat, into a new format of looking at the future, how he plans to set up his government, and all of those kinds of things. So even though I think some of the pillars will be similar, particularly his stance on anti-corruption, I do think his approach and his style will be quite different. He has a number of, including his president-elect, Vice President-elect Osinbajo. I think that the two of them together really make a really good team. You have an academician, a very thoughtful, scholarly vice president, and you have somebody that is very dogged in his vision for Nigeria in the president-elect. And I think the combination of those two things really can set Nigeria on a great path. And one of the big takeaways for me out of the election was really the whole atmosphere. I think that there was this fear prior to the election that you were going to have violence, and you were going to have lots of violence, and you were going to have all of these other things that didn't come to pass. And I think that says a lot for Nigerians. You know, a lot of times Nigeria, prior to the election anyway, would get reduced to a sentence about security in the north. And it would say security in the north, but you're really talking about the northeast, which is about the size of the state of Georgia. And you're not making a comparison for the entire country when you're talking about the northeast. And so I do think dealing with security, dealing with the poverty issues that we've already talked about, I think are going to be really the hallmarks of his administration.
That's heartening to hear, I'm sure, for a number of Nigerians. You mentioned briefly the need for job creation in Nigeria. Previously in the 1980s, under then Buhari, Nigeria engaged in a lot of import substitution, industrialization. Do you think that was sort of a current of the times and being caught up in the ideological bend of dependencia theory? Or do you think that under General Buhari, the Nigerian government will take perhaps a stronger role in promoting development through government actions and government subsidies than it did under President Goodluck Jonathan?
I think you need to separate the two things. You've got subsidies and then you've got development issues. And to me, they don't belong in the same basket. Certainly, development issues, I think, will be front and center for President-elect Buhari. What he does on subsidies, I think he's going to really have to work with a good macroeconomic team to figure that out. You know, there have been attempts in the past, even under the last administration, to remove the oral subsidies. And you know, that didn't go over well. You had labor strikes over almost a week period of time at the beginning of 2013. So you don't want to go back to that. So they're going to have to figure out, he's going to have good technocrats on the financial, macro-financial side to determine how best to ease out of subsidies so that you don't also create an additional problem by having instability in urban areas where people cannot buy fuel to be able to go to work and do the daily things that they need to do. So that he's going to have to balance those two things. But I think development, and he's from Katsina, he's from the north. He knows the northern region quite well. And he's seen the need for development not only in the north, but certainly in the rest of the country. So I think that he's going to be able to balance well those two things. And the key will be to see who he puts in those positions. That's kind of what I'm waiting for next. You know, once he is sworn in on the 29th of May, 2015, and puts his team together in terms of ministerial posts, I think that's going to be a precursor on how, for us to see how he's going to manage and divide up what's important, what's first, what needs to be done. And certainly within that, I think whoever is the defense minister is also going to be key.
Absolutely. I know that you've been involved with a number of organizations and initiatives to promote entrepreneurship and private sector development in Nigeria. So which sort of sectors would you advise President Buhari to emphasize in this incoming administration?
Well, there are three, actually. One, of course, is food security, particularly in the north, and particularly in the northeast quadrant. If you have an opportunity where they're able to provide better security in their region, then you're going to have people coming back to villages that no longer exist or that can no longer provide for commercial or farming opportunities for the people that were pushed out of those regions by Boko Haram. So how do you deal with that food security issue in the northeast quadrant? That's number one. Generally, food security is a challenge in the north, even in the best of times. And so that would be the other part of the food security aspect. I would add to that shelter, because if you are struggling with food security or poverty, then the likelihood is that you don't have either good shelter or shelter at all. Nigeria has about a 17+ million housing deficit, affordable housing deficit right now, and that's on a good day. So housing, which seems to get left off a lot when we talk about development initiatives, would be one that I would put on the table. One that's very near and dear to me is SMEs, or small and medium-sized enterprise development. Because if you're looking at a population of 172 million people, of which half are both women and people under the age of 25. So what does that mean for job possibilities or job creation? For me, that means you need to really focus on vocational training and entrepreneurship alongside of basic and formal education. Because are you going to be able to create enough formal jobs for that many people looking for work every day? I would probably argue not. And so having entrepreneurial training, vocational training, I think are going to be really key.
And you mentioned the challenges that Nigerians will face as they attempt to return to some of these villages that have been destroyed by Boko Haram. During my visit to Nigeria, I was fortunate enough to visit 2 of the internally displaced people's camp in Nigeria, and that's certainly a looming social crisis, both in terms of providing temporary shelter for these displaced people, but also longer-term resettlement issues. And one of the scholars that I spoke with had recently completed a World Bank report on the state of IDPs, and they estimated that just within the 5 states bordering northeastern Nigeria, there was an estimated 2 to 3 million internally displaced people. So going forward, promoting development in that region through food security, job security, and rehabilitation.
I think it's really important. One of the things that I thought was, and it may not have really come out in the news that much here, but they did make provisions for IDPs to vote during their elections. The estimate that they have is not quite as high as 2 million. It was about 1.6 million IDPs, and there were IDP centers for IDPs to vote. And so I thought that that was really kind of an unwritten success also of the election process, because they did focus on IDPs and they did have election centers. And several members of the team that I was on that were up in Adamawa and other places, they were able to go to a few of the IDP election centers.
That's fantastic. One of the people that I spoke with in speaking with the ministry, the Nigerian ministry charged for caring for IDPs, found that they only had records in order to provide care for 100,000 IDPs. So it's also just an issue of increasing government capacity and conducting a census. But I'd like to shift a bit towards American-Nigerian relations. How would you characterize them under outgoing President Goodluck Jonathan, and what can we expect under General Muhammadu Buhari in terms of American-Nigerian relations?
I think taking the person out of it first, I'd like to say that U.S.-Nigerian relations are extremely important, and they will always be very important. You've got the largest economy on the continent. You've got the continent with the largest population. You've got incredible ties between Americans and Nigerians back and forth, and business ties, social ties, family ties, et cetera. So that importance is never going to go away. I won't say no matter who's in power, but kind of, that's what I mean. The relationship with President Goodluck Jonathan, I think for the most part was fairly good. He met on several occasions with President Obama, and I think that toward the end of his tenure, however, as the Boko Haram issue became more and more dire, the relationship had a few ups and downs in that process, where I think the Nigerians felt we weren't doing enough to help them, particularly with selling them high-level hardware, particularly air support craft, Cobra air helicopters and things like that. And of course, you know, we are governed by the Leahy Amendment, so there were some restrictions there that I think was really hard to convey those things to the Nigerians. So there was a little bit of tension that lasted for a couple of months, and they really finally got over it, and the relationship got back on track. So I suspect that General Buhari, President-elect Buhari, will have a similarly dynamic relationship with the United States. I would not be surprised if coming to the United States would not be one of the first things that he might do. Might not be the first thing, but I think it would be in the top 10 of things that he might do. And certainly the presence of Secretary Kerry going out there before the elections, having Assistant Secretary Greenfield on the ground, Thomas Greenfield on the ground, during the elections. The embassy, I understand, fielded lots of observer teams throughout the country. So we care about Nigeria, and the presence and the interest of the U.S. in Nigeria was evident. The President of the United States also did a video right before the elections to the Nigerian people, and that's kind of rare that the President of the United States does that. We've heard him do it on a couple of occasions, and this was one, and that's just how important this election was to the United States and Nigeria is to the United States.
Absolutely. And you sort of alluded to the regional task force to combat Boko Haram. I was hoping that you could elaborate on how this regional task force has altered Nigeria's relations with its neighbors, including Niger, Cameroon, and Chad, all of whom have contributed to this regional force to sort of stem the insecurity in Nigeria's northeast.
You're talking about the multi-regional national force. The multinational force, Niger, Cameroon, Chad, and of course Nigeria. Right before the elections, as you know, the elections were supposed to be held on the 14th of February. They were postponed for 6 weeks in order to further or better address the insecurity in the Northeast. And you saw successes during that period by the Nigerians and the Chadians in particular were very successful in pushing back Boko Haram in areas that it previously held. And I think that with the shift in governance there with President-elect Buhari, I think you're going to see a better and more dynamic, robust engagement with those governments. Because one thing they definitely need to do, in addition to the ground operation, there needs to be better sharing of intel across neighbors. Because without that, you're going to always have a situation where you might be behind the curve. So I think that I expect to see not only the robust cooperation and operational implementation on the ground, but I would assume then that you'll have a more robust intel sharing relationship as well. The question will be, what are they going to do with the 300 plus South African mercenaries that they have in the region? So that's something that I'm looking to see what they're going to do.
It's certainly a challenge. During the most recent exercise, Flintlock, which is a training exercise conducted by the United States and other Western partners for African governments participating in the Trans-Saharan Counterterrorism Partnership, the United States really emphasized improving intelligence gathering capacities and communications capacities for regional task forces. Right, exactly. So, do you know any more?
Yes, I mean,
about
when I was there, we had several exercises as well, and the real challenge is sort of interoperability. That's always going to be a challenge when you're bringing forces from different nations together. How command and control, how they communicate, all of those are very important elements. So, given President-elect Buhari's military background, I know that he's going to put those things front and center as he looks at how to address the security situation in the Northeast.
Right, and I think sometimes it's overlooked exactly how much the extent of the insecurity has hampered the Northeast's ability to develop. One of the traders I spoke with during my time in Kano estimated that 80% of businesses in Borno State had been closed, 70% in Adamawa, and another 50% of businesses in surrounding communities. So stemming this conflict is going to be critical for engaging in this sort of job creation and economic development.
In addition, what I talked about earlier, having people come back from either IDP camps or refugees, what are they going to come back to? Because commerce is at a standstill in places like Borno and Maiduguri in particular, which was a hub of commerce for really the entire state. That's really been rolled back extensively. So, those things have to be looked at before you start encouraging people to go back to their areas, because they're going to face a situation where you're going to have what I talked about earlier, the food insecurity aspect, because there's nothing there. So it's a really, really dire situation, not only in Maiduguri. When I was there, I went up to Dikwa and past Dikwa, which was about 3.5 hours or so, by road, really tough driving out of Maiduguri, and then, of course, going to Borno through Yobe and Adamawa by road. And so, looking at all those villages that I know used to be there and used to be engaged in commerce and farming, and you've got, Fulani traders as well as Hausa, and all of those kinds of activities going on, those have all ceased. And so, unless that's addressed, it's going to be a real difficult environment for people to come back to. And so, I would like to see, and I'm hoping to see that, as Boko Haram is pushed out, then you have services from the nation coming in right behind that, so to be able to provide a platform for people to come back to.
Fingers crossed for that. Thus far, I think the most robust plan for that has been President Goodluck Jonathan's Victims Support Fund for victims of Boko Haram. What impact do you think his defeat on the presidential elections will have on the future of that fund? I spoke with someone on the board of it prior to the elections, and he said they were still waiting for the vast majority of the pledged support given at a fundraising dinner in the winter of 2014 to come in. So do you think that these pledges will be followed through, or do you think that a new initiative under President Buhari will have to be adopted?
You know, I think it will be up to the president-elect and his team to decide whether or not this fund is something, in its current incarnation, is something that they want to encourage, or they want to revamp it to better address things that they see. So I think that either way, something has to be done and something has to be maintained. So either they're going to look at the current fund and decide that the structure is what they want and they can maintain it, or they may have a better idea. I mean, he has a lot of very good advisors around him. Not only technocrats, but intellectuals, and he has a pretty dynamic team, I think, around him. So they're going to be looking, and they probably have already looked at all of these things, because I really expect President-elect and his team to really hit the ground running. So I would assume that they have thought through some of these things.
Well, they certainly have a number of challenges awaiting them. So frequently when we discuss Nigeria, it's boiled down to merely the insecurity in the Northeast. But it's worth noting as well that the amnesty program that was put into place for the Niger Delta militants will expire in May. So what do you foresee happening with regards to the Niger Delta militants with the swearing in of President-elect Buhari?
Well, I think I was there when the amnesty program started, and so there were a lot of doubters at that time that the amnesty program would work, and it had some fits and starts in the beginning, but in the end, I think it did what it was supposed to do. And I would assume that going forward, even if it does expire, I think that the governors who are going to be elected this Saturday will have to pay attention to the environments that they're managing to determine whether or not it needs to be renewed. There's a question or not of whether it needs to be renewed. Has it done the complete job it was supposed to do? And I think that first you're going to have the new governors look at that. I think that would be the first step. And then for them to then make a recommendation to the new president-elect as to what to do next. But it might be that the fund has done what it's supposed to do, and that maybe it's time to move on and focus really on the development of the region.
Absolutely. And since you brought it up, could you touch upon the significance of this Saturday's gubernatorial elections for Nigeria?
Yeah, I think that I just did a little article in Huffington Post about let's not take our eye off the ball on the governor's election, because they are equally as important as the presidential election for a number of reasons, because the governors, the executive governors as they are called, they control a vast amount of financial resources for their state in terms of the oil derivations that come from the federal account. And so it'll be very, very important to ensure that their election process and whatever glitches were in the presidential process in terms of the biometric readers and materials arriving to polling stations on time, and INEC officials getting there on time, and a few other things, that they get worked out. And I'm sure that INEC is doing 24/7 work to make sure that that happens for Saturday. So I'm optimistic that Saturday coming we'll not see as many glitches in the logistics process that we saw on the 28th and 29th of March, and that the process will go smoothly. And I hope that the voter turnout will be equally as significant as it was for the presidential election.
Absolutely. And while there were some glitches, it's also worth noting that the biometric card readers failed less than, I think it was 10% of the time, according to an independent civil society auditor of this, which is just astounding. So not only was the technical capacity of the elections really admirable, but also the patience and commitment of Nigerian citizens to the democratic process was inspiring.
Right. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I'm calling the voter the superheroes of the election process because, I was out there, 12 to 13 hours, and the voters that I engaged with and saw were out there, 15 and 16 hours all day long. And they were committed, sometimes very first voters, particularly a lot of women that I spoke to. It was the first time they were exercising their right to vote. And I think that, as far as the biometric readers are concerned, it depends on where you were in country, whether or not you saw more instances where the biometric reader didn't work. And the card reading part of it did work, but the biometric part on many cases, on some cases, didn't work. So it's interesting that you note that figure. But regardless, if the biometric reader didn't work, then they went to the manual. And there were so many checks and balances throughout the process. I don't even know if I would have the patience to go through all of the checks and balances that were put in place, both micro and macro. To really, in some cases, even nano, because there were so many steps to get to before you were able to cast your vote. It was just amazing to see that in action. And I guess in addition to the voter being the superhero, I would also say that those who worked and did volunteer work for voter mobilization and voter education did a fantastic job. Particularly in the rural areas, you could see that. Getting people to the polls. Voters knew what to do when they got up to the table. And it was really impressive given the number of steps that you would have to go through to cast your vote. I was just really impressed by the voter education and the mobilization aspect.
Absolutely. And it was significant not only for Nigeria, but it was one of a handful of examples of peaceful democratic transitions of power in African countries. So Nigeria has always been sort of the giant of Africa in terms of populace, in terms of economic growth. And now there's sort of, I think, a real tangible hope that it could become a model for robust democracy.
Right. I agree with you. I mean, as a best practice, I think that Nigeria can get there on two fronts, not only on the conduct of this actual election and sort of the president of World Affairs Council in his introduction sort of alluded to that, but I also think that, President Jonathan had a moment that we cannot overlook, because if he had behaved any differently, I think we could have had a very different aftermath of the Nigerian election. He did three things that I think were really, really statesmanlike and really showed another step toward democracy in Nigeria. You had him not only call the president-elect, you had him go on national television and give a national conciliatory speech, but in a very gentlemanly, statesmanlike manner. And I think that when we look at democracy, we forget that that's also, those elements are also hallmarks of democracy. You can have a peaceful election in terms of conduct, but what we tend to see on the continent is those who are defeated not behaving in the democratic way. And President Jonathan did that, and I think that he needs to be given a lot of credit for that, because without that, we could be looking at a very different post-Nigerian election atmosphere. So for me, on both counts, not only in terms of the conduct of the election, but the conduct of behavior at the time of the outcome of the election, I think was a hallmark for Nigeria in so many ways, and an example for not only Nigeria and the continent, but for all developing or evolving democracies around the world.
I agree wholeheartedly, and I think Goodluck Jonathan is an early contender for the 2015 Mo Ibrahim African Leadership Award for his statesmanlike conduct. So just to close out before we move to a question and answer session with the audience, what do you think are the lessons for Nigeria from the last election moving forward with future presidential elections?
I think, once we have the election on Saturday and, if there are other lessons learned that will come out of that, I think they all need to kind of be put together and addressed going forward. I think INEC is, and the chairman, I think what he did is Nobel Prize worthy, actually, in so many ways, because when you look at the impact of the alternative would have been devastating for the nation and for the continent, as an example. So I think that he gets a lot of credit for what I call the mental gymnastics of figuring out all of these micro and macro steps that you can put in place, not only just with technology, but certainly with process, because the sequencing of how you had to vote was equally important to combat fraud. And so those two things together, technology alone could not have done it without the sequencing. And so I think that his forethought in being able to try to figure out all of those possibilities where fraud could come in and try to find something, whether with technology and or process, that would address that, I think is commendable. So I think coming out of this, some of the lessons will be, how do you make the biometric readers be 100% useful in terms of or reduce their failure rate, even though it may be small, but to reduce it even further. Continue with voter education and mobilization, so it's not such a yeoman's job, a year or 6 months out before an election, and build on the hope that's there in terms of democracy and change. Because you have to have change that comes out of this in terms of the everyday life for the everyday Nigerian. Other than that, it's just an act. You've got to have the fundamentals that change on the ground. And so I would hope to see in the next 5 years that this is the order of the day, and that the best practices that have come out of Nigeria become so the norm, that the Nigerians are not astounded that they can have a successful election, but more importantly, that the rest of the world is not astounded that Nigeria can have a credible, free and fair election.
Thank you so much.
I understand that Nigeria is actually one of the first countries in the region that will be having elections over the next 2 years. What are some of the impacts you think this election will have on those other countries? And if you think we can hope for a repeat of such peaceful transition happening elsewhere, or if people's fears and preconceived notions may play out?
Well, I think the whole notion of cookie cutter I try to stay away from, because each country has its own internal dynamics that you have to figure out how to manage. But on the macro level, I think that Nigeria having a successful election gives hope to the voters in other nations that possibly can happen also in their country. Every country has its own internal dynamics, whether or not you have an election commission and you have civil society as robust as it was for this election for Nigeria. Those are all factors. You've got to have all of those things. The role of civil society in this election was enormous. The Transition Monitoring Group, TMG, I had worked with them before in the run-up to the last election. They have matured so significantly. They fielded volunteer monitors all around the nation to do parallel vote tabulation. So all of those things are elements. And I think that for the continent of Africa, all of those things are going to be really important per country to be able to have a civil society that is robust and have the things in place that can help you as a nation. But I think it does give Africa a step up that Nigeria had one, and I think it'll be a positive sign for other countries going forward.
Absolutely. Just to build off of that point, some of the high-profile elections that will be underway shortly include South Sudan, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Burundi. And all of these countries have very different states of development of civil society. So if anything, I think the Nigerian election should act as sort of a galvanizing force for Americans seeking to promote civil society development. And I know my friends at the National Endowment for Democracy were very pleased with the conduct of this election.
Absolutely.
Given the result in Nigeria, do you think if elections in Nigeria, in Africa, are generally free and fair, will the incumbent always be thrown out?
I mean, I think, it's up to the Nigerian voter. None of us vote in Nigeria's election. It's really the Nigerian voter. But I think what this does show because the ruling party had never been voted out before, that the power of the vote and the power of change, and if you have a transparent election, then that should set the stage for the person that the voters want to be in office to get there. Now, whether or not that's going to be a trend that you're going to have APC in office for the next, 30 years, I don't know. But I think what it does provide and provides a platform for is for Nigeria to have free and fair elections, and they know they can have it, and they're not going to accept anything less than that now going forward. And so it's really up to them which party they want to vote in. The issue is really the process.
I'm Lawrence Freeman, the director of the Africa desk at ERI Magazine. I was in Nigeria before, during, and after the elections as well. And I think the Nigerian people deserve a lot of credit. Jega definitely deserves a lot of credit. And I think it was good what Jonathan did to prevent any violence. But I wanted to ask about basically the U.S. policy, because in my stay in Abuja, and I was in the suburbs in a fairly decent area, decent house, the electricity doesn't exist. And we have 2,500 megawatts distributed per day. And so you're out, no electricity. I mean, if you stay at the Nikon Noga, you may have it all day long, but in a normal house, you're not going to have it. Unemployment is imaginable. You have able-bodied men selling chewing gum on the side of the road. I've seen this for 25 years. I've been in Nigeria. So what I would think we should do, and I think the U.S. should play a role in this, is you need essentially an approach of Franklin Roosevelt. You need massive infrastructure and electricity and roads. This is not going to be done by entrepreneurs of the private sector. The approach that, for example, China and the BRIC countries are taking for infrastructure development and credit, shouldn't this be what the United States does? The United States has these relations with Nigeria, and they've been pretty bad the last few months, but we don't provide help in building infrastructure. We don't provide help in these areas. We leave it up to the private sector. So don't you think at this momentum point for Nigeria, and I discussed this myself with General Buhari before I left, don't you think we should provide real investment like a Roosevelt plan to build up the country? Otherwise, the economy is going to overwhelm any presidency. The Obama administration, I'm going to deal with, kind of bifurcate your question a tad, talk about the power issue and then the broader development aspect. The Power Africa is President Obama's initiative for dealing with the power issue in Nigeria. It is just a small part of what the U.S. can do, but I sort of fall into the column that you need both the private sector and the government in order to do this, and you need the U.S. to continue to push on its Power Africa initiative. But I think the role of both the Nigerian and the U.S. private sector is really going to be very, very important. We do have the Millennium Challenge account, which if you don't know about it, I would suggest you take a look at their website. But that's a compact where you work with a nation like Nigeria. Nigeria has not yet qualified for MCC because you have to have all of these other things in place like transparency and democracy and all those kinds of things. But I would hope that with the election of President-elect Buhari, that Nigeria could move toward, not probably within this year, but maybe if possible, toward a MCC that would address infrastructure, that would address additional resources toward power, additional resources toward development that you highlight. So I'm hoping that Nigeria, now that they've been able to have this transparent and democratic election, that the other elements that are on the indicator list that you have to have in order to qualify for MCC, that Nigeria will be able to move in that direction. And that opens up a tremendous amount of opportunities for Nigeria in the infrastructure, in health services, because if you know about MCC, it's really working together with a country to have a planning structure that you can address all of these different things. Clearly, power is a big problem for the continent writ large. You have 600 million people out of the 1.6 billion people on the continent that are without power on a daily basis, and that number continues to grow. Nigeria, certainly you have a large number of a large percentage of the population without power. So power is critical, not only for daily living, but certainly to do business or anything. And so I do think the Power Africa is a great program. I'm hoping that going forward, the U.S. government can build on that even more, and I'm hoping that Nigeria can move to a point where it can be considered at least an MCC threshold country, and then possibly an MCC compact country down the line. The Power Africa program is looking at building these huge power structure, and it takes a while. It takes a while. We had to first get the money out of Congress. I mean, there's a lot of steps involved. So clearly, I'm not saying that it's produced any power, but at least we're on the path to try to get there, along with partnering with the private sector in Nigeria to do that, in Nigeria and in Africa to do that, in the 6 countries where Power Africa is.
Based on President-elect Buhari's previous time in office and maybe some of his thoughts from then until now, are there any predictions that you can make around his economic policies or priorities?
Well, I mean, I don't want to speak for the president-elect. I think that he's already stated that for his economic platform, he's going to be looking at job creation. And we talked about how important job creation is in addressing the fundamental poverty issues that a lot of Nigerians face on a daily basis. And I think that it'll be key to see who he puts in place in the Ministry of Trade, in the Ministry of Agriculture, in the Ministry of Finance. All those key ministries that will have a role in rolling out an economic plan to address some of those fundamental policy issues. So he has said, he has stated clearly even throughout his campaign that, development, job creation, combating corruption are key things that he's going to be looking at. And so I am hoping that they will be front and center as soon as he's sworn in on May 29th.
Just to build off of that question, I think agriculture in general has been perhaps neglected in Nigeria since the discovery of oil. So could you talk about viable strategies to build upon agricultural production in Nigeria in order to promote not only food security, but also economic development?
Yeah, agriculture, as you know, most of the Nigerian population is involved in some form of agriculture or subsistence farming, some in the formal sector, some in the informal sector. So you've got that issue, and then you've got the self-sufficiency or lack of self-sufficiency issue in key commodities in Nigeria. So they import wheat to make flour and all of these other challenges that a country like Nigeria shouldn't have to do because the resources are there. So with the last administration, there was a shift to really focus a lot on agriculture. And I think that some of the things that Minister Adesina did were quite positive. So I'm hoping to see that particularly since President-elect comes from an agricultural state like Katsina, that he will focus on finding ways to have what I like to call farmer entrepreneurs. Really finding a way for farmers not only to provide subsistence for themselves and their family, but to work together in cooperative-like structures so they're able to produce enough to be able to sell their produce and their commodities to market. And there are lots of small micro examples around the continent. I work with a couple of, not that I'm doing any kind of self-promotion, but I work with a couple of organizations, one in particular, Songhai, which is really focused on their Washington director, really focused on making farmers entrepreneurs, having farmers think about farming in a business capacity, in an entrepreneurial capacity. So not only are they providing for themselves, but they're working with other farmers so that they're able to produce enough yield to be able to sell, to be able to have a better quality of life for themselves and their families. So I'm hoping to see more things like that in Nigeria. We have 5 Songhai sites in Nigeria, but it doesn't have to be Songhai. It can be anything that provides that farming entrepreneurial spirit for the farmer.
And where are those programs if you have 5 in Nigeria?
We have 3 in Katsina, 1 in Lagos, Enugu, and Rivers. and Cross River is not online yet, but we're moving in the right direction, and the one that's in Cross River as well.
That's fascinating. In my brief time in Nigeria, I was shocked to learn that the country is the 5th largest exporter of sesame seeds in the world, just because it's been so categorized as a petrostate. So in coming years, particularly given the current nadir of global oil prices, do you see Nigeria diversifying away from oil wealth? Or what role do you see oil wealth playing in promoting or preventing economic development in Nigeria?
I think that it's going to be a while before you have Nigeria not looking at its oil revenues as the prime focus of foreign reserves for it. You know, whether or not you think the low oil prices are a double-edged sword for Nigeria, some people are arguing that this is going to force Nigeria to look at other sectors, particularly agriculture, as a way to move forward in the country. And so, you know, I think that there's some value in arguing that, but I think even if you argue that, theoretically, it's going to take a longer time to make that U-turn. But I think once that U-turn is made, where you have a more diversified economy, because you're right in terms of the sesame, but also cashews. You know, there are a lot of things that Nigeria can export, is exporting, because the agricultural exports have increased over the last couple of years, but there's in no way competing with, you know, the oil issue. But you know, if oil prices stay low, Nigeria is really it's going to force Nigeria to really step up to the plate a little bit more in other sectors. And I would argue that agriculture would probably be the first one they would need to.
Right, and prior to the discovery of oil in the 1970s,
Agriculture was right front and center.
the bulk of government revenue,
Right, exactly.
and particularly in the agricultural strongholds of the north.
And the other thing about the oil sector, even if the prices do increase, I think that probably most of you know that in August, the U.S. was not importing any oil from Nigeria. And I remember when I was out there for the World Economic Forum, someone asking me, you know, why is the U.S., the U.S. is not importing any more oil? And then I was out there later in the year, and you stopped completely, and, you know, what's the problem? And certainly, most of you probably know that, of course, we're producing more shale oil, of course, in the United States, and natural gas, so our demand has shifted, plus the sweet crude oil from Nigeria doesn't mix well with the shale oil, so we've been actually taking oil from, other nations where mixing with the shale oil is an easier refining process than it is with sweet crude. So I think that Nigeria will have to look at all of these things because even if the price increases a little bit, it doesn't mean that your traditional countries of export are going to be the same. And certainly in the case of the U.S., that might be where we end up.
I'm Ken Hansen. I'm a project finance partner at Chadbourne & Park, a law firm. And I've had opportunity to play, I suppose, a small bit part in the Power Africa initiative through clients. Those clients included private developers, agencies, including U.S. government agencies, and multilaterals, in particular the World Bank. And I can explain the connection between that if anyone's curious and the question, but it really goes to the prospects of a number of power projects succeeding going forward. Say, in particular, it's quite well known that one, Azura, was it's been rather a premier project, commenced construction last fall. That's all been our fall. That's all been demobilized because of issues at very high level of the government. So my question is, what is the prospect for change with respect to the folks in the cabinet? I think there are some situations where no change would be terrific to encourage private investment in infrastructure, and a couple other changes are important. But is there a presumption that there will be a wholesale turnover, as there typically is here, or perhaps not?
I would actually assume that there would be a wholesale turnover, but it's still up to the president-elect if that's what he decides. But I think that in listening to voters and you're hearing this resounding roar for change, I think they meant wholesale change.
I haven't followed things so closely, but he hasn't sort of announced his slate.
No, he has not. He hasn't been sworn in yet. He won't be sworn in until May 29th. Right. And so he may already know who his cabinet players are, but he has not announced, and he probably will not do that until he's sworn in, or maybe right before. But going back to sort of the baseline of your question, and listening to sort of the premise of the election and what voters were really wanting to see, when they said change, I heard them say wholesale change. And so just based on their energy and what they wanted and how eager they were and all the things that they talked about, they wanted to see their vote do. I interpreted that to mean that they wanted to see wholesale change because of the fact that they wanted, wherever corruption was, they want to make sure that it is no longer there, and maybe the only way to do that is to really start over with wholesale change. So that's how I interpreted their call for change.
With reference to the question that came before regarding government, at this point there's a terrific array of both private and public sector resources ready to support infrastructure, especially power, and more broadly in Nigeria. And frankly, the government's got to get out of the way.
Right. Well, I don't think the government's got to get out of the way. I think the government has to have the right regulatory frameworks, and they've got to do that. Yeah. So you can't do one thing without the other. So I think we have to be realistic, because particularly in Nigeria, when you're looking at whether you're talking about the petroleum industry bill finally being passed or all of these other regulatory frameworks, you have to have those. So I think we tend to get into a pixie dust kind of conversation where we're talking about government getting out of the way sometimes, because you have to have the regulatory frameworks in place, which I know coming from a law firm. So we need both things, and we need transparency in both things. I don't think you can exclude the private sector, because the resources are going to have to come from the private sector to do some of these mega projects, infrastructure projects. We've made some mistakes. You've pointed those out, but I think it's a learning curve for everybody involved, whether it's government or the private sector.
I don't think I did. I might be able to, but I didn't know that.
Right.
The government I was talking about was the Nigerian government.
I'm also talking about the Nigerian government.
All right, good.
I am only talking about the Nigerian government. You're going to have the PIB is the Nigerian legislation that's been in draft. I've seen 15 of them myself, so I don't know what version the draft is now. Even when I was there, I saw a billion draft. It still hasn't passed. And so the PIB is the petroleum industry bill, just as an example to your question. I'm saying that government in Nigeria can't get out of the way completely because they have to establish a regulatory framework. Mm-hmm.
Well, regardless, I think it's exciting times in Nigeria, and the extent to which wholesale change will be achieved will also depend on the elections this Saturday. So thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. Thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.